James had always been a meticulous man. His day began early, preparing his son's lunchbox with the precision of a watchmaker. Nothing was left to chance. The sandwich was always cut into perfect triangles, the fruit chosen carefully, the favorite cookie to sweeten the day, and the chilled juice kept cool with a small ice pack. He liked to imagine Michael's smile when opening his lunchbox at school. However, lately, that smile seemed to have vanished. Every evening upon returning home, Michael devoured dinner as if he hadn't seen food all day. At first, James didn't pay much attention. A 9-year-old boy in a growth phase was normal, but something in the desperation with which Michael ate made him start to observe more closely. Days passed, and his son's hunger continued to be worrisome. The plate was scraped clean in minutes, as if the boy were returning from a forced fast. It made no sense. James knew exactly what he put in the lunchbox, more than enough for a nutritious lunch and an afternoon snack. One night he decided to ask directly, "Son, are you eating your lunch at school?" The answer came hesitantly, accompanied by a fleeting look. "Yes, I do, but I get hungry quickly." James narrowed his eyes. Michael had never been good at lying. He felt an uneasy pit forming in his chest. Something was happening, and he needed to find out what it was. That night, while Michael slept, James sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything he put into his son's lunchbox. He noted every detail: the type of bread for the sandwich, the filling, the color of the apple, the exact position of each item inside the lunchbox. He felt it might be a bit excessive, but something inside him screamed that he needed to be meticulous. When Michael returned from school the next day, James wasted no time. He grabbed the lunchbox and opened it. His heart pounded. It was completely empty. There were no crumbs, no remnants, nothing at all. James's jaw tightened. He looked at his son and calmly asked, "Did you eat everything?" Michael nodded firmly, but his eyes avoided his father's. James felt a lump in his throat. He knew his son better than anyone. Michael was hiding something, and he needed to know what. In the following days, James repeated the experiment. Every morning, he prepared the lunchbox exactly the same way, memorizing every detail. And every afternoon, he found the same scene, an empty lunchbox, with no sign it had ever been used. It was as if the food had evaporated. The unease grew inside him, transforming into a terrible certainty. Someone was taking Michael's food. But who and why? The idea that his son might be being bullied filled him with indignation. He needed to act. But first, he needed proof. James decided that a direct approach was the best option. That night, after dinner, he sat next to Michael on the couch. He took care with his tone, trying to sound more curious than accusatory. "Son, are you sure you're eating your lunch?" Michael diverted his gaze to the TV, where a silent cartoon was playing. "Yes, Dad," he replied quickly. But James noticed the slight trembling in his fingers and the way he clenched his hands on his lap. He took a deep breath. "Then explain to me why the lunchbox comes back empty, with no sign of food at all. Not a crumb, not a wrapper, nothing." This time, Michael did not answer immediately. He bit his lower lip and shrugged. "I eat fast," he murmured, but it was an answer that didn't convince him. James saw that forcing the conversation wouldn't help. If Michael was hiding something, it was because he was afraid. And if he was afraid, that meant there was a serious reason behind it. The next morning, James got up earlier than usual. He decided to observe his son more closely before taking him to school. He noticed that Michael was quieter than normal while having breakfast, as if he were mentally preparing for something. When it was time to go, James accompanied him to the door and watched as he walked to the bus. There was something strange in his gait, a subtle hesitation, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. James's intuition screamed at him. He needed to act quickly. He could no longer ignore the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Determined to dig deeper, James picked up the phone and called the school. He requested a meeting with the principal, Mr. Reynolds, as soon as possible. To his surprise, the man was receptive and scheduled the meeting for that very afternoon. When James arrived at the school, he was greeted with a firm handshake and an attentive look. "What brings you here, Mr. Carter?" asked the principal. James explained everything: the disappearance of the food, his son's strange behavior, and the certainty that something was wrong. The principal listened intently, but his response was frustrating. "We haven't received any reports of bullying or lunch theft," he said. James felt his irritation grow. He knew something was happening, and he wasn't going to simply accept a vague answer. It was then that the principal called Michael's teacher, Mrs. Palmer. She entered the room with a gentle yet worried expression. "Michael is a great student," she said, "but I've noticed that lately he seems quieter, more isolated." James leaned forward in his chair. "And during lunch? Does he eat normally?" The teacher hesitated before answering. "Actually, no. He usually says he isn't hungry, and sometimes he leaves the table early." James's stomach turned. So it wasn't only at home that Michael was different. Something was really happening at school, and he needed to find out what. Given this new information, James suggested that they speak directly with some of Michael's classmates. The principal agreed, and within minutes, 3 students were called into the room. They were boys from the same class, children who shared recess and supposedly lunchtime with Michael. James watched intently as they settled into chairs, some fiddling with their shoelaces, others staring at the table, clearly uncomfortable. "Have you noticed anything strange about Michael's lunch?" asked the principal. There was a hesitant silence until one of the boys, Ryan, finally spoke. "He never eats with us." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" he pressed. "He says he isn't hungry," explained another classmate, Noah. "Or sometimes he disappears before opening his lunchbox." James exchanged a look with Mrs. Palmer. This made no sense. If Michael wasn't eating with his friends, what was he doing with his food? The answer came unexpectedly. The third boy, Liam, seemed to remember something and casually commented, "Once I saw him throwing something in the trash." James frowned. "Throwing it away?" he repeated, as if the words didn't make sense. Liam shrugged. "I didn't see clearly. I just remember he was near the trash can." The lump in James's throat tightened. His son was not only avoiding eating in front of his friends, but was also getting rid of the food. That wasn't normal. Something was making Michael so terrified that he preferred to go hungry. The principal and the teacher also seemed uneasy. "This confirms that something is wrong," said Mr. Reynolds, "but we still need to understand why." James left the meeting feeling the weight of a growing worry. Michael was hiding something, and now he was sure it wasn't just a case of loss of appetite or distraction. The simple fact that his son avoided eating in front of friends and possibly disposed of his food indicated fear. But fear of what? Or worse yet, fear of whom? As he walked through the school corridor, lost in thought, the soft voice of Mrs. Palmer made him stop. "There is something that might be relevant," she said in a lowered tone. "Michael seems especially nervous during math classes. Mr. Clark, he's new here, and some children seem a bit uncomfortable around him." James felt a shiver run up his spine. Until that moment, he hadn't considered the possibility of an adult being involved. The name Mr. Clark didn't mean much to him, but the teacher's suggestion set off an alarm in his mind. He decided he needed to see this teacher in person. He asked the principal to arrange a meeting with Mr. Clark that very day. A few minutes later, he was led to a small room where he found a tall man with impeccable posture, wearing a polite but cold smile. "How can I help you, Mr. Carter?" asked the teacher, crossing his arms with a measured calm. James observed every detail, the way he maintained a fixed and calculating gaze, the slight raise of his eyebrow, as if he already knew what it was about. "My son Michael seems apprehensive in your classes," James said directly, "and I would like to understand why." Mr. Clark maintained his smile, but his expression subtly hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied. "Michael is an excellent student." James didn't like the answer. It was vague, too rehearsed, as if the teacher had already prepared for any questioning. He leaned slightly forward, remaining calm but not breaking eye contact. "So you haven't noticed any change in his behavior lately? Nothing unusual?" Mr. Clark gave a brief smile, not showing his teeth. "Kids that age change all the time, Mr. Carter. Growth, friendships, school pressure, anything can influence them." James felt his jaw tighten. The teacher wasn't directly denying anything, but he wasn't offering any useful information either. It was as if he were deflecting the conversation without seeming evasive. James decided to try a different approach. "And during lunch, have you ever seen Michael eating?" This time the pause was almost imperceptible, but James noticed. Mr. Clark's gaze remained steady, but there was a single moment, in which something flashed across his expression. "Not that I can recall," he finally replied. James left that room with an uncomfortable certainty in his chest. Mr. Clark knew something. He had no proof, just his instinct, but that brief moment of hesitation was enough to set off all his alarms. He returned home feeling frustrated, knowing he couldn't accuse anyone without concrete evidence. Michael arrived from school shortly after, looking tired, and James realized that pressing him wouldn't help if his son didn't trust him enough to tell the truth. It was because fear had held him back. That's when an idea emerged. If Michael couldn't speak, perhaps there was another way to discover what was happening. James looked at his son's backpack and knew what he needed to do. He would seek answers on his own. That night, while Michael slept, James put his plan into action. He took a small audio recorder he used for meetings at work and tested the microphone to ensure it would capture sounds clearly. Then he waited until he was sure his son was in a deep sleep before carefully opening his backpack. With steady yet quick hands, he slid the device into the front pocket of the bag and adjusted the setting for continuous recording. The goal was clear: to discover what was happening to Michael's food without his having to say anything. James felt a bit guilty for doing this without his son's knowledge, but the need to protect him spoke louder. He couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, James accompanied Michael to the door and watched as he walked to the bus. There was a slight tension in the boy's shoulders, something James couldn't ignore. As soon as his son left, he looked at his watch. Every minute of that morning seemed to drag, as if time were testing his patience. He tried to concentrate on work, but his mind always went back to Michael's backpack and what the recorder might reveal. When the dismissal time finally came, James waited anxiously for his son's return. As soon as Michael entered the door, James hugged him and asked trivial questions about the day. He waited until the boy had gone up to his room before taking the backpack and retrieving the recorder. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed the play button. What he heard in the first few seconds made his blood run cold. The audio began with trivial sounds: chairs scraping, children talking, the usual murmur of the school cafeteria. James gripped the recorder tighter, waiting for something that made sense. Then came the sound of a zipper being opened. It was Michael, rustling in his backpack. A second later, a deep and controlled voice emerged, low but clearly audible. "Give it to me." James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The voice was firm, without hesitation. He didn't need to see to know it was Mr. Clark. The silence from Michael on the other side of the recording was deafening. Seconds later, the soft noise of an object being removed from the backpack. More silence. Then Mr. Clark spoke again, this time in a lower tone, almost a whisper. "You know the rules." James felt his stomach turn. He held the recorder so tightly that his knuckles went white. Michael's voice emerged, weak and hesitant. Can I at least keep the apple?" James's heart pounded in his chest. There was a pause, and then Mr. Clark's cold, calculated response came. "Eat quickly and don't say anything." The recording continued, but James couldn't bear to listen any longer. He turned off the device and took a deep breath, trying to process what he had just discovered. His son wasn't just having his food stolen. He was being coerced, intimidated in a subtle yet cruel manner. This wasn't a simple case of bullying among students. It was something much worse, and James knew he couldn't let it go unpunished. James felt his chest tighten with anger. He got up abruptly, pacing around the room, trying to contain the impulse to rush immediately to the school and confront Mr. Clark. But no, he couldn't act on impulse. It wasn't just about delivering justice. He needed to ensure that this man would never have the chance to do something like this again, neither with Michael nor with any other child. He sat down at the kitchen table, breathing deeply. He thought about what he had in his hands, a clear, direct recording with undeniable evidence. But would it be enough for the school to take action? What if they tried to downplay the situation? What if they created bureaucratic obstacles? He wasn't going to allow it. Mr. Clark had already spent too much time intimidating his son. James was determined to put an end to it. Before acting, he needed to talk with Michael. He slowly climbed the stairs, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He found his son sitting on the bed, idly playing with his fingers, as if he already knew that a conversation was about to happen. James sat next to him and, for a moment, fell silent. Then he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and spoke as calmly as he could muster. "Son, I know what's been happening." Michael froze. His eyes widened slightly and James felt his son's breath quicken. "I listened to the recording," he continued. "You don't need to hide this from me." "Ah!" Michael swallowed hard, looking away. James did not push further. He simply waited. Gradually, Michael's small shoulders began to tremble. He bit his lip hard before finally whispering, "I thought I had no choice." James felt a pang in his heart, hearing his son's words. He took a deep breath, fighting the anger that grew inside him, not against Michael, but against the man who had made him believe that staying silent was the only option. "Son, listen carefully to what I'm going to say." James kept his voice firm but filled with tenderness. "What he did to you is wrong. You must never, ever accept something like this." Michael rubbed his eyes with his small hands, shaking his head. "But he never really threatened me. He just said those were the rules." James closed his eyes for a moment. It was worse than he had imagined. Mr. Clark didn't use direct threats, didn't yell, didn't physically hurt. He manipulated. He made the children believe that this was normal, that they had to obey. James ran his hand through his son's hair, trying to convey reassurance. "You will never have to go through this again, I promise." Michael looked at his father with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, though fear still lingered. "What are you going to do?" The question came hesitantly, almost timidly. James held his son's hands and smiled slightly. "I'm going to handle this the right way, but first, you need to know that none of this is your fault." Michael bit his lip, his eyes filling with tears. "But I should have told someone sooner." James shook his head. "No, son, the one who did wrong here is him. You were just trying to deal with it the only way you knew how." Michael finally nodded, still uncertain but less tense. James knew that this would be the first step in healing the fear his son carried. The next step was ensuring that Mr. Clark would pay for what he did. James spent the night awake, going over every detail of what he would do the next day. He knew that simply storming into the school and yelling at Mr. Clark wouldn't solve anything. He needed to be strategic. The plan was clear. Take the recording directly to the principal and demand an immediate response. But at the same time, James didn't want to give any room for excuses or attempts to minimize the gravity of the situation. At the first light of morning, he got dressed calmly yet with a firm purpose in mind. While having breakfast, he noticed Michael watching him from the table, his eyes still laden with uncertainty. "Will everything be all right, Dad?" he asked quietly. James walked over to him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "It'll be better than all right, son. It will be over." As soon as he arrived at the school, he didn't waste any time. He walked straight to the reception and demanded an urgent meeting with Principal Reynolds. The secretary, noticing the seriousness in his tone, expedited the process, and within minutes James was seated in front of the principal. Without any preamble, he took the recorder out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "I want you to listen to this," he said, keeping his gaze steady. The principal frowned, but pressed play on the file without questioning. The silence in the room was broken by Mr. Clark's deep, controlled voice. "Give it to me." Then came Michael's hesitant request. Can I at least keep the apple?" When Mr. Clark's cold response echoed in the small office, James saw the principal's expression change. First confusion, then shock, and finally a deep discomfort. When the recording ended, Mr. Reynolds took off his glasses and massaged his temples. "This is unacceptable." James kept his eyes fixed on the principal, waiting for his next reaction. He didn't want to hear just words of indignation. He wanted to see action. "You understand the gravity of this, right?" he asked, his voice controlled yet unyielding. Principal Reynolds slowly nodded, still processing what he had just heard. "Yes, this cannot be ignored." He picked up the telephone on his desk and dialed an internal number. "I need Mr. Clark to come into my office immediately." James felt his heart race. He was about to confront the man who had terrorized his son and robbed him of his dignity. But now he was not just a concerned father. He was a father, armed with the truth. When the door opened, Mr. Clark entered with his usual serene demeanor, as if nothing in the world could shake his composure. "Good morning, Principal," he greeted with a polite smile. His eyes swept over James quickly, but without showing any concern. "You called me for something urgent?" The principal interlaced his fingers on the table, his expression stern. "Yes, please have a seat." Mr. Clark complied, crossing his legs in a calculated manner. It was then that Reynolds pressed play on the recorder. Mr. Clark's face remained impassive in the first few seconds, but as the recording progressed and his own voice echoed through the room, his mask began to crack. James watched intently, noticing how his jaw tensed and his hands clenched slightly on his knees. Then the final phrase came, "Eat quickly and don't say anything." The ensuing silence was deafening. Mr. Clark's expression was unrecognizable. The calm he had tried to maintain was replaced by visible tension in every muscle of his body. Principal Reynolds didn't take his eyes off him. James knew that this was the decisive moment. Mr. Clark, who until then had been so calculating and controlled, was now clearly uncomfortable. The silence that hung in the room seemed interminable. The teacher tried to start speaking, but the words wouldn't come out. James could see he was trying to regain his composure, but he failed to maintain his facade of authority. It was the principal who broke the silence, his voice deep and firm. "Mr. Clark, the gravity of what is being heard here cannot be ignored. The actions you have taken with these children are completely unacceptable and violate every standard of professional behavior. You are being suspended from the school immediately and will undergo a formal investigation." Mr. Clark's face paled. He looked at James, who remained motionless with a determined expression. The teacher took a deep breath and tried to regain control. "This is all a misunderstanding. I am a good teacher. None of this is as it's being portrayed." He raised his hand as if to interrupt, but the principal was direct. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Clark. There is no more room for your explanations. The recording speaks for itself. We are revoking your teaching license and referring this case to the appropriate authorities." Mr. Clark was clearly losing his composure. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he avoided making eye contact with the principal. "It can't be," he stuttered, trying to formulate a response. But the words failed him. In front of him, James saw a man who until that moment had seemed invulnerable, now completely crumbling. The coldness he had exhibited in the classroom had disappeared, replaced by a man desperately trying to salvage what remained of his dignity. James felt a grim satisfaction watching this unfold. The relief of finally seeing this man unmasked did not bring him joy, but a sense of justice served. He looked at the principal, who was already in contact with the school board and the police. The case was now out of anyone's hands who might try to protect Mr. Clark. The work was being done, and the guarantee that other children would not go through the same experience was now a reality. When Mr. Clark was escorted out of the room by security, James felt no pleasure in the triumph. The feeling was of a duty fulfilled, but also of a heavy weight that still remained. He knew that the emotional impact of this would not end there. Michael's healing would take time. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. The battle had been won, but the work was just beginning. He needed to take care of his son, help him understand that despite everything he had been through, he was now safe. Michael was free, not just from physical threat or constant hunger, but from a psychological trauma that James was only beginning to understand. He knew that although the worst was behind them, the recovery process would be long, but he was determined to be by Michael's side every step of the way. After Mr. Clark was removed from the school, James felt the adrenaline begin to subside. He was still sitting in the principal's office, watching as Mr. Reynolds finished documenting everything that had happened. The atmosphere seemed heavier now, as if everyone present were trying to process the gravity of the situation. "The school cannot tolerate this kind of behavior," said the principal, pressing his lips into a thin line. "We will contact all the parents of the children who were his students to ensure that nothing similar has occurred elsewhere." James nodded slowly, knowing that even if Michael had been the only target, which he doubted, it was essential to ensure that no one else went through the same. Before leaving, James made one last demand. "I want you to guarantee psychological support for my son. He was manipulated, intimidated. This isn't going to disappear overnight." The principal agreed immediately. "Of course. We already have psychologists available for the students, and we can recommend more in-depth follow-up if necessary." James stood up, running his hands over his face in a gesture of pure exhaustion. "Great. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go home and take care of my son." The principal simply nodded, clearly understanding the weight of the moment. James left the school feeling as though he had won a great battle, yet he still wasn't sure how he would handle the emotional aftermath. When he arrived home, he found Michael sitting on the couch, fiddling distractedly with the TV remote without really paying attention to what was on the screen. The boy looked at his father with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "So, what now?" he asked in a soft voice. James sat next to him and put an arm around his small shoulders. "It's over, son. He will never bother you again." Michael blinked a few times as if trying to absorb those words. He's gone?" James nodded. "He's been removed from the school and will never work here again." For a moment, Michael just stared at the floor, processing everything. Then, without warning, he threw his arms around his father and hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dad." His voice was choked, laden with emotions he still didn't know how to express. James held his son tightly, feeling the little body still trembling slightly. "You are safe now," he whispered. Michael nodded against his chest, and for the first time in weeks, James saw his son finally believe it. In the following days, even with the threat removed, James noticed that Michael still carried the weight of what had happened. The boy tried to act normally, but James observed the small signs, prolonged moments of silence, furtive glances when he opened his lunchbox, the way he hesitated before taking the first bite. The fear was still there, ingrained in his routine. That's when James decided they needed a new beginning. On Saturday morning, he woke up earlier and prepared Michael's favorite breakfast, pancakes with strawberries and honey. When his son came down to the kitchen, he blinked in surprise at the set table. "What is this?" he asked with a small, shy smile. "A special breakfast," said James, pulling out a chair, "because today we're going to do something new." Michael frowned, curious. "Something new like what?" James smiled. "Today you're going to prepare your own lunch." The boy's eyes widened. Me? His father nodded. Exactly. We're going to the market to buy everything you want for your lunchbox. You choose, you prepare. That way you'll know exactly what you're taking and no one will ever take it away from you again. Michael bit his lip, thinking. James waited patiently, without pressuring him. Finally, a sparkle appeared in the boy's eyes. Okay, he said slowly, but I want to make a different kind of sandwich. James laughed. Deal! We'll invent a new one. That morning was unlike any other. In the supermarket, Michael ran through the aisles, choosing ingredients with an enthusiasm James hadn't seen in a long time. The boy grabbed whole wheat breads, cheeses, cold cuts, and even a little jar of special sauce. When they got home, he assembled his sandwich with absolute concentration, as if he were creating something unique. I'm going to call it Michael's Mega Sandwich, he said proudly, while James applauded his creation. In that moment, James realized that this simple act of choosing and preparing his own food was an important step for his son to regain control over his own life. On Monday morning, when James watched Michael close his lunchbox with a small, satisfied smile, he felt genuine relief. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. He knew his son still carried invisible scars, but seeing him gradually regain confidence was a sign they were on the right path. Ready for school? He asked, grabbing the car keys. Michael nodded, tossing his backpack over his shoulder, but before they left, he hesitated for a second. Dad, what if someone asks about Mr. Clark? James took a deep breath. He knew that question would come sooner or later. You don't need to answer anything you don't want to, son. But if you do speak, just tell the truth, that he did something wrong and that he is now gone. Michael seemed to ponder for a moment and finally nodded. On the way to school, Michael was quieter than usual, but his posture did not show fear. It was more of a silent reflection. When they arrived, James stopped the car and looked at his son in the rearview mirror. Everything's going to be fine, okay? Michael opened his lunchbox for a moment, checking his food as if to be sure it was still there. Then he smiled slightly. Okay, Dad. James watched him get out of the car and walk toward the entrance. At the gate, he saw some classmates calling out to him. Michael paused for a second, then joined his friends. It was the first time in a long time that James saw his son behaving like any other child his age. He let out a long sigh, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The worst was over, but he knew Michael's journey of healing was only just beginning. That afternoon was different from previous ones. When James picked Michael up at school, he noticed that his son seemed lighter. There was something in the way he walked to the car, as if an invisible burden had been lifted from his shoulders. So, how was your day? James asked, trying to sound casual but attentive to every detail. Michael shrugged, tossing his backpack onto the back seat. It was fine. Everyone was talking about Mr. Clark, but no one really knows what happened. James frowned. And you? What did you say? The boy looked out the window. Nothing. I just listened. James respected the silence. He knew Michael was still processing everything and that it would take time before he felt completely comfortable talking about it. But at least he no longer seemed to carry that paralyzing fear. When they got home, Michael went straight to the kitchen. James watched as he opened his lunchbox and took out the leftover pieces of his sandwich. For the first time in weeks, he had food left over. Not because he didn't want to eat, but because he had autonomy over it. James approached and ruffled his son's hair. Did you like your Michael's Mega Sandwich? The boy laughed. I think I overdid the cheese. James laughed along. It's all part of the experience. It was a simple moment, but full of significance. Michael was beginning to regain something that had been taken from him, the right to decide, to feel safe, to have control over his own life. James realized it wasn't just about food, it was about trust. And he was determined to ensure that his son would never again feel so helpless. In the following days, James continued to observe Michael closely without pressuring him, but always available if he wanted to talk. The boy seemed calmer, although he still exhibited certain habits deeply ingrained by the fear he had felt for so long. At Sunday lunch, for example, James noticed that Michael still ate too quickly, as if conditioned to finish before someone could intervene. "Hey, no rush," said the father, grabbing a little more food for himself. "No one's going to take this from you." Michael blinked several times, as if needing to register that information. Then he slowed down his pace, chewing slowly. It was a small progress, but one that meant a lot. On Monday, the school principal called James. "We wanted to update you about Mr. Clark's case," she said in a serious tone. "He has officially resigned from his position, and the school is cooperating with the investigation." James let out a long sigh. "Does that mean he can't teach anywhere else?" There was a brief pause before the answer. "If everything goes as expected, no. The authorities are taking care of it." James didn't like the uncertainty implicit in those words, but he knew he had done his part. Now he needed to focus on what was most important, ensuring that Michael moved on without carrying this trauma forever. Before hanging up, the principal added something that caught James by surprise. "I think you'll like to know. Michael came to talk to me today. He told me he wants to help other children who might go through something similar." James felt a lump in his throat. His son was transforming his pain into something greater. James fell silent for a few seconds after hanging up. He knew Michael was a strong boy, but he hadn't expected his son to take the initiative to speak with the principal about helping other children. That meant that, despite everything, he didn't want to hide. He wanted to do something to ensure that no one else went through what he went through. It was a powerful thought for a child of only 9 years. When Michael arrived from school that afternoon, James didn't mention the call immediately. Instead, he waited until his son was comfortable, playing video games on the couch before starting a conversation. "I heard you spoke with the principal today." Michael paused his game and looked at his father hesitantly. "Did she tell you?" James nodded. "Yes, I'm proud of you, son." Michael fiddled with the game controller, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just thought maybe there were other children going through this who didn't have anyone to help." James felt a mix of pride and sadness. It was painful to know that his son had matured in this way, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. "Do you want to talk to your classmates about what happened?" he asked carefully. Michael thought for a moment and shook his head. "Not yet, but maybe someday." James smiled and tousled his son's hair. "When you're ready, I'll be here to help." Michael gave a small smile and went back to his game. James stayed by his side, saying nothing more, just enjoying the moment. His son was reclaiming his space in the world. The days went by, and James noticed that Michael was gradually readjusting. He still had moments of silence, especially when he saw classmates commenting on the sudden disappearance of Mr. Clark, but he no longer avoided the subject as before. One afternoon, while the two were in the kitchen preparing another Michael's mega sandwich, the boy looked up from the bread he was assembling and asked, "Dad, do you think he did that to other children too?" James took a deep breath before answering, "I don't know, son, but I believe that if he did that to you, he may have done it to other children before." Michael was thoughtful for a moment. "And what if no one else talks about it?" His tone carried a weight that James recognized immediately, the worry that silence would allow the evil to repeat itself. James knelt down to be at his son's level and gently held his shoulders. "You had the courage to speak up, and because you spoke, he can't hurt anyone else." Michael bit his lip, still pensive. "But what if other children go through something similar with another teacher? How will they know that they can speak up?" The question caught James by surprise. He hadn't expected his son to think so far ahead, but that only reinforced how deeply this experience had affected him. "Maybe you can help change that when you feel ready," James suggested. "Sometimes all it takes is one person having the courage to speak up so that others know they aren't alone." Michael seemed to consider this. He didn't answer immediately, But James saw something shift in his expression, a quiet but real determination. At the end of that week, something unexpected happened. When James went to pick up Michael from school, he noticed that the boy was walking alongside a classmate, Ryan, one of the boys who'd been called in to speak with the principal weeks before. They were talking animatedly, and Michael even laughed at something his friend said. It was a sound James hadn't heard in a long time. As soon as he got into the car, Michael placed his backpack in the back seat and said, as if it were normal, "I told Ryan." James turned his head, surprised. "Told him what?" Michael adjusted his seatbelt and looked out the window. "About Mr. Clark, about what he did to me." James felt his heart race. "And how did he react?" The boy shrugged. "He said he thought there was something strange about that guy, but he never knew what it was." James gripped the steering wheel tightly, absorbing the new information. "And how did you feel about telling him?" Michael was silent for a moment, then shrugged again. "It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be." He turned to his father and smiled slightly. "Actually, it was kinda good." James nodded slowly, feeling immense pride in his son. Telling the truth required courage, and Michael had taken a gigantic step. "I'm glad you did, son." Michael sighed, relaxing a little in his seat. "I think maybe one day I can tell more people." James smiled and ruffled his hair. "When you're ready, I know you'll do it the right way." He knew this was only the beginning of Michael's journey to overcome what he had experienced, but now he was sure that his son was finding his own path. That evening, as they had dinner together, James noticed that Michael was different. Not only did he eat more slowly, but he also seemed more present. There was no longer that shadow of fear in his eyes, that constant worry that something bad would happen. He talked more, laughed more, and even joked about how much sauce James put on his plate. It was a quiet but significant progress. After dinner, while they were washing dishes together, Michael asked suddenly, "Dad, have you ever been afraid of someone before?" James paused for a moment, reflecting. "Yes, son, I have." Michael dried a glass, looking intently at his father. "And what did you do?" James smiled slightly. "It took time, but I realized that fear only has power over us when we let it grow in our minds. As soon as I started talking about it, the feeling became smaller." Michael frowned, processing that answer. Then he set the glass in the sink and wiped his hands on a towel. "I think talking to Ryan made me feel that way." James felt his heart fill with pride. "That means you're getting stronger." Michael smiled slightly. "I think so." That moment seemed simple, but to James, it was one of the greatest victories he could have as a father. He knew the road ahead was still long, that some scars would remain, but Michael was learning to transform his experience into something that made him stronger. He was no longer the child who accepted rules imposed by fear. Now he understood that he had a choice, and that was the greatest freedom James could ever give him. Over the weekend, James decided that Michael needed a moment to just be a child again. School, questions, bad memories. All of it had weighed too heavily on him in recent weeks. So he grabbed the car keys and said to his son, "Let's go out for a while." Michael looked at him confused. "Where to?" James smiled. "Surprise." On the way, Michael began to try to guess the destination, and with every wrong guess, James laughed and refused to reveal it. When they finally stopped in front of an amusement park, the boy's eyes lit up. "Really?" James nodded. "Really?" He wanted Michael to feel the lightness of simply having fun without worries. And it worked. For the first time in a long time, Michael seemed completely free. He ran from one attraction to another, insisting that James join him on the most thrilling rides. They laughed until their stomachs ached, ate cotton candy until their fingers stuck together, and tried to win a giant teddy bear at the ring toss booth. Without success, but with plenty of laughs along the way. At one point, while resting on a bench, Michael looked at his father and said, "Thank you for this." James smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "You deserve it, son." Michael sighed, watching the activity in the park around him. "You know, I think I'm ready." James frowned. "Ready for what?" The boy turned to him, eyes full of determination. ready to talk about what happened, not just with Ryan. I want people to know. James looked at his son with surprise and pride at the same time. Michael was no longer the frightened boy who avoided eye contact and hid the truth. There was a new firmness in him, a conviction that James hadn't expected to see so soon. "You want to tell your story?" he asked, making sure his son knew he didn't have to do anything he wasn't comfortable with. Michael nodded. "I do, because if I had listened to someone talk about it before, maybe I wouldn't have been so afraid." James felt a lump in his throat. His son was transforming his pain into strength, and that was something even he couldn't teach. It was a choice Michael made on his own, a step that meant more than any word could express. When they returned home, Michael took a notebook and began to write. James didn't want to interrupt, but he stayed nearby in case his son needed support. The boy scribbled, erased, rewrote, and after a while closed the notebook and took a deep breath. "I think that's it," he said. James carefully took the notebook and read his son's words. It was a letter to the school, recounting what had happened to him, how he felt, and how no one should have to go through that in silence. In the end, Michael wrote a sentence that made James's throat tighten. "Fear is not a rule. No one can force you to follow something that is wrong." He looked at his son, who now stared at him expectantly. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Michael smiled and nodded. "Yes, it's time." On Monday morning, James took Michael to school with a mix of pride and apprehension. He knew this decision was his son's, and that Michael was determined to speak up, yet a part of him still wanted to protect him from any possible negative reaction. When they arrived, Michael clutched the notebook tightly without showing any hesitation. "Do you want me to go with you to the principal's office?" James asked. The boy thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I can do it on my own." James swallowed hard, remembering how, weeks earlier, his son had barely been able to admit what was happening. Now, there he was, ready to face everything head-on. James stayed in the car and watched as Michael walked across the courtyard, greeting a few classmates before disappearing through the school entrance. He felt his heart race a little. He knew his son was ready, but still, it was hard not to worry. About an hour later, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the school. "Mr. Carter, we would like to inform you that we received Michael's testimony and are impressed by his courage. We have decided to share his message with the students so they know they can always seek help. We want you to know that your son did something extraordinary today." James reread the message several times, feeling immense pride swell within him. Michael had transformed his experience into something bigger than himself. He had not only regained his voice, he ensured that other children would also have the chance to do the same. That night, when picking up Michael from school, James noticed that something was different. His son entered the car with a determined look, but also with a slight smile, as if carrying an alleviation that he hadn't felt in a long time. "So, how was it?" James asked, trying to contain his anxiety. Michael let out a sigh and looked out the window for a moment before answering. "It was strange at first, but once I started talking, it got easier." James nodded, respecting his son's pace. "Did anyone say anything to you?" Michael looked at him and smiled slightly. "Ryan thanked me. He said that if he ever needed help, he'd know he could ask." James felt his heart warm. He knew that this was only the beginning for Michael, that there would still be hard days, unsettling memories, and moments of doubt. But now his son was no longer alone in his fear. He had freed himself from the weight of silence and, more than that, had shown other children that they too could do the same. When they got home, Michael placed his backpack in the corner of the living room and collapsed onto the couch with a satisfied sigh. James sat next to him and lightly tousled his hair. "Proud of you, champ," Michael laughed, playfully pushing his father's hand. "Me too, Dad." For the first time in a long time, James saw on his son's face something that had been missing in recent weeks. Calm. He was finally at peace. The following days were different. Michael seemed lighter, more at ease with himself. He still spoke little about what had happened, but when the subject arose, he no longer averted his gaze or changed the topic. It was a quiet, yet powerful progress. One afternoon after school, Michael opened his lunchbox at the table and without a second thought took half of his sandwich and offered it to his father. "Want a piece?" James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You're offering me part of your famous Michael's Mega Sandwich?" The boy laughed. "This time I made it just right. It's meant to be shared." James took the piece, feeling a lump in his throat. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. For weeks, Michael had had his food snatched from him, along with his sense of security. Now, not only did he have control over it, he chose to share. As he chewed, James looked at his son, who was eating calmly beside him. "You know, son, when all this started, all I wanted was to protect you, but I think it was you who taught me something." Michael frowned, curious. "What?" James smiled, thinking about how his son had been braver than many adults ever would be. That courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about what we do despite being afraid. Michael was silent for a moment, then shrugged with a small smile. "I think you're right." James tousled his son's hair and laughed. "Note that down, because I don't always get it right." Michael laughed along, and in that moment James knew his son was truly well. That night, while Michael slept, James stood by his bedroom door for a few minutes, just watching. His son breathed calmly, his face serene, without the traces of tension that had burdened him for weeks. James felt a profound relief. He knew Michael's journey was not over, but for the first time since it all began, he was sure that his son was on the right path. Michael was no longer the boy who accepted fear as part of his routine. He had reclaimed his space, his voice, and above all, his freedom. James smiled softly and turned off the hallway light, letting his son rest in peace. The next morning, while having breakfast, Michael looked at his father and said, "I think tomorrow I'm going to tell my story at school." James raised his eyebrows. "Are you sure?" The boy nodded, determined. "Yes, I want other children to know that no one can make them feel small." James felt indescribable pride. He knew that this moment wasn't about the past, but about Michael's future. "Then you know I'll be there, listening to every word." Michael smiled. "I know, Dad." And in that moment, James was certain that his son had not only overcome fear, he had transformed it into strength.